Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends, patrons. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 33. Today, I would like to discuss Africa Day, sometimes referred to as Africa Liberation Day. And it's celebrated on May 25th, and it's commemorating the founding of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, May 25th, when 32 leaders of newly independent African states met in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, to found the Organization of African Unity, whose name is self-explanatory. The OAU, as it was known, has since been replaced by the African Union, AU, as of 2002. And obviously, the names are not reflected in the reality of contemporary Africa. So the founding of the OAU was very critical. It was a great lost opportunity for Africa. And that's why I want to spend some time discussing it today, and also outline some of the reasons why it was difficult. Capital and imperialism was never going to allow the OAU to succeed. But we'll go a little bit into the history briefly. Before I get into it, I want to talk about two books. I always talk about Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And I know some of you have told me, you've sent me messages that you bought the book and you found it very informative in terms of contextualizing Africa's contemporary challenges, because Nkrumah was really far-sighted and able to analyze the challenges that Africa would face if the continent did not unite into a United States of Africa. I strongly recommend the book, even if you don't have time or you're not sure about whether you should order it or not. Then you can go online, and if you put the title, you Google the title, you will be able to read the introduction. There are a couple of websites that have posted the introduction, which is not very long, but essentially it summarizes the substance of the book. It does a very good job, and I think it will give you a very good flavor, and then you'll be able to decide whether you still like to get the book or not. But there are two other books I want to mention before I get into it today. One is African Socialism. This is published in 1962, and the author was Fenner Brockway. He was a British socialist member of parliament, anti-imperialist. He really was a big supporter of the independence struggle in Africa during the 1950s, when nationalism was really taking hold on the continent. So I strongly recommend that book. It really discusses his meetings with the early leaders who were emerging at that time in Africa, especially the ones, the socialist leaders, like Kwame Nkrumah, of course, like Julius Nyere, like Sekou Touré. So his conversations with these leaders at that early critical stage, this is even before the founding of the OAU, because as I said, the book was published in 62, which means the conversations he had with them must have been in the early 1960s. And it's very informative in terms of the possibilities that really existed at that time, that Africa would have been able to take a very different course, the possibilities, which of course were not realized. And hence today we have all these Comprador States in Africa, which essentially are empty shells. You have so-called leaders fulfilling the interests of imperialism and capital, with the vast majority of the African citizenry not participating at all in national affairs, and that's the problem. So I recommend that book as well, and I'll be able to discuss it in another future podcast. And there's another title that I recommend, False Start in Africa. And you can get this as well as African Socialism from abbybooks.com. If you go to Amazon, you'll find that the price is completely ridiculous, prohibitive. In one case, a couple of hundreds of dollars. But if you go to abbeybook.com, I think you can get them for like $25 or at the most maybe $30 or $35. And this book, False Start in Africa, was also published in 1962. And the author, René Dumont, D-U-M-O-N-T, was a French economist and agronomist. And he also, in his own way, predicts the challenges that the continent would face without a United States of Africa. And his focus was on the economics. Even though Kwame Nkrumah also focuses on the economics, he approaches it from a political perspective. Union was absolutely necessary for Nkrumah. In the case of René Dumont, union essential, at the very least, political union. So that was his focus in this book. And also, I'll have an occasion to discuss that book in a future podcast. But I strongly recommend these two titles, which I'd never mentioned before. And I recently just finished reading these titles. And also, just a quick update. In one of my next podcasts, I want to discuss the whole issue of foreign aid, or so-called foreign aid to African countries from the industrialized countries. Is it really foreign aid? Or what does it really disguise? Is it the reason that Africa is being held back? Is it not really aid, but a burden meant to prop up these Comprador States in African countries? So what do? Should we agitate for the elimination of foreign aid? Or are conditions so dire in many countries that it would sound preposterous for anybody to be critical of foreign aid? So we'll look into that in a future podcast. And then finally, in one of my next podcasts, I will also discuss my upcoming book, Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. And this is essentially me looking at the history of representation or misrepresentation of Africa. Demonization, I guess is the better word, from the 18th century to the contemporary times. And I won't discuss much of it today because, as I said, that will be the subject of a future podcast. The book will be published very soon. I don't have an exact date from the publisher, but I understand it's going to be either the first or second week of June. And then obviously I'll also provide information how to order the book. The company is called Kendall Hunt Publishing, Kendall Hunt, Hunt Publishing. And at some point it will be available through their website. So I'll give you an update on that as well by the time I do a podcast focusing on the book. So let me get into today's subject, Africa Day. The day on May 25th, 1963, when the leaders of the African countries that had won independence by that time, so on that occasion there were 32 countries. Today, of course, there are 54. And Kwame Nkrumah made a memorable speech. And that speech, you can actually also find it online, or at least excerpts of it, not the entire speech. And you can Google, or rather go to YouTube and search for the speech. It has the title, something like Kwame Nkrumah's iconic 1963 speech. And I think it's excerpt, you get about 15 minutes of the speech, but it captures the argument that he made. And essentially he said, we must unite or perish. And he wanted an immediate unification of the African continent into the United States of Africa without any delay. And had Nkrumah's urging been adopted by the African nations, the continent would most definitely be in a different position today. Africa would have been able to protect its sovereignty. Africa would have been able to protect its resources and use Africa's resources to develop and build Africa. Africa would have been able to defend its independence and not be in a position where it would just stand by helplessly. And let's take an example of the NATO invasion of Libya in 2010, 2011, regardless of however anybody might feel about Muammar Gaddafi, for NATO to invade an African country and essentially destroy it and unleash that amount of killings and destruction and unleash all those weapons that are now causing havoc throughout the entire North, Central, and West African region. It is mind-boggling, and nobody is going to pay any compensation for that war of aggression launched against an African country by NATO. And obviously, such an occurrence would never happen if we had a United States of Africa. And if anybody wants another example also, just look at China. China used to be the playing field, the playground for Western imperialism. Certainly, that is not the case today. And we all know the reason behind that, because China was changed profoundly after the Chinese Revolution. And it was able to harness its resources and manpower to build China. And I like giving this example that I've used in the past. In 1960, the income per head, per capita income in China was $90. In Ghana, it was $189. That was then. Today, China is about $10,000. Ghana is about $2,500. These are figures from 2019, 2020. So the gap must even be larger as I speak today. So China did it within such a short time, which means there are examples that African countries can pursue and take as inspiration. And I just think that if Nkrumah was still living today, as a very old man, still in exile, because ultimately Nkrumah was overthrown and he died in exile. I could just imagine the bitter pain he would be feeling and just knocking his head and saying, all they had to do was to have accepted my urging that African countries come together as the United States of Africa. So instead, we have the Comprador States. We have a new form of imperialism, neocolonialism, that essentially we've seen since the 1960s, when most African countries won their so-called independence. But of course, it was independence on paper alone. It was just a transformation of the same control over Africa, as Walter Rodney liked to say, that Africa was placed in a peripheral and dominated position in the global system for the last 500 years. We obviously first had the enslavement regime And then after the contradictions made that unsustainable, when we had industrial capitalism, so the exploitation transitioned into colonialism. And when that also became unsustainable with the contradictions, then finance capital took over, and with that came neo-colonialism, so that you no longer need to have European governors in Africa. You have African compradors class, and the overarching structure now are the institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, to enforce contemporary imperialism. Of course, China is a new player on the scene here in the 21st century. China is now industrialized. This is not the China of the 1960s. So the China of today is fully engaged in exploiting Africa's resources as well. And people have asked me whether there's a vast difference between what China's conduct in Africa and the West. And of course, in a previous podcast, I said that China has not launched wars of invasion against any African country, but the exploitation of Africa's resources is just as detrimental to the development of an independent, viable African continent heading toward the United States of Africa. And that's that's primarily the fault of the Comprador class that operates in Africa. They are not trying to use resources from China to try and change Africa's position in the global system. No, not at all. In fact, they're using the resources that have become available from China simply to sustain their regimes. So just as they use resources from the West, from the World Bank, from the IMF to maintain that class in African countries, the resources in China used for the same purposes. It's not used to empower the rural farmers, for example, where the vast majority of Africans still live, not used to bring them into the economic and political system within African countries. So you have the elite in Africa exploiting Africans using resources from China or from the West. And in return, they are sustained in power, either by Chinese capital or by Western capital. So with this kind of arrangement, we will never really move toward African union and African unity. It is not going to be done by the ruling elite. It really has to be done by the masses, which is also another thing that actually René Dumont discusses in his book, False Start in Africa. Because even as early as 1960, he could already see the outcome of a new elite in Africa, African elite that were going to become entrenched and whose interests were much more reflective of the interest of the European ruling class rather than the interest of the vast majority of Africans. So he does discuss that in that book as well. That's why I strongly recommend that book. So at the, I just like to read a little bit of what Nkrumah said at the OAU meeting in Addis Ababa. All right, so let me read one of the quotes here. If we fail and let this grand opportunity slip by, then we shall give way to greater dissension and division amongst us, for which the people, the masses of the people of Africa, will never forgive us. And the popular and progressive forces and movements within Africa will condemn us. So this is Nkrumah talking about the lost opportunity. Obviously, he did not know that his proposal was going to be rejected at that time, but he was describing what would happen if Africans failed to form a United States of Africa at that conference in Addis Ababa, May 25, 1963. He outlined the proposal further, and you can hear it when you listen to the speech that I indicated in the beginning of today's episode, whereby he says we need to have the foreign ministers that are attending this conference immediately form a committee, foreign ministers of all the African countries, and then they would select the two of the best brains from each African country and work with them to come up with a draft constitution for the United States of Africa, come up with an outline for an African common market, an African industrial policy, an African common defense policy, an African common currency, an African transport system, and then ultimately a government for the United States of Africa. And he proposed that that committee comprising the foreign ministers come back with a report to the heads of states within 6 months. It was very ambitious, but at the same time, Nkrumah deeply understood that imperialism was not going to allow Africa to be independent and really developed into a global power as well. So the onus was on the African leaders, but unfortunately not many of them were as far-sighted as Nkrumah was. The only leader who actually supported immediate union at that conference was the Prime Minister of Uganda at that time, Apollo Milton Obote. The rest were not that eager for immediate unity. And then as time elapsed, it became much more difficult to form an African union. And Nkrumah, of course, was one of the African leaders who did his best to try to change at least Ghana's position relative to the global system. In addition to advocating for African unity, he tried to industrialize Ghana using Ghana's resources. He built that great Volta Dam project at Akosombo to generate electric energy to use for factories and to industrialize Ghana. And that should be one of his lasting legacies because it still operates today. But Nkrumah was, of course, as we've discussed in previous podcasts, overthrown in 1966 in a coup d'etat by the Ghanaian military and police, essentially under the instruction of the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency, and British and French intelligence. And essentially, their biggest beef with Kwame Nkrumah was that he could have actually succeeded in convincing African countries to form a United States of Africa, which of course would have increased Africa's bargaining position with respect to its mineral and natural resources when dealing with the rest of the world. So that was indeed, as Nkrumah indicated in his speech, a great lost opportunity for the continent. In 1997, Julius Nyere, who is one of my heroes in terms of African leaders, made a speech when he visited Ghana. Now, this is 34 years after the 1963 OAU conference, and it's 25 years after Nkrumah had died. Nkrumah died in 1972 in exile in Guinea. And Nyerere conceded that he had made a mistake. At least he was honest enough to acknowledge his error in not supporting Nkrumah's push for United States of Africa and going with the group of leaders who were supporting a much more, what they called it was gradualism, stage by stage toward unity in Africa. And those were referred to as the Monrovia Group, and the others who had advocated for immediate unity. After the conference, even though at the conference only Milton Obote was immediately supportive, other African leaders started coming around to Nkrumah's vision, and they came into what was then referred to as the Casablanca group. And of course, it included Ghana as well. So anyway, Nyerere acknowledged his mistake, and I want to read something that he said in that speech, which in terms of he's explaining why it became much more difficult for African countries to come toward unity after the 1963 OAU conference in Ethiopia. So I quote from his speech, parts of it. Once you multiply national anthems, national passports, seats at the United Nations, and individuals entitled to a 21-gun salute, not to speak of a host of ministers and envoys, you would have a whole army of powerful people with vested interest in keeping Africa balkanized. So in this case, ironically, he's referring to the vested interest within Africa itself by Africans, not even referring to the outside forces, whom are the ones that Nkrumah feared the most, that want Africa to remain balkanized. So I'm glad that Nyerere, whom I admired, acknowledged that he had made a big error in not supporting Nkrumah's call. Obviously, Nyerere was highly respected in Africa and around the world, and things might have turned out differently had he supported Nkrumah and helped in making the argument to persuade other African countries that really United States of Africa was critical to Africa being able to function as an independent power, protecting its sovereignty and resources, and really determining and guiding its own destiny. So where do things stand today? Well, the African Union, the AU, has existed since 2002. And the new thing that the AU has come up with was something called the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or Free Trade Area. And it officially took effect the beginning of this year on January 1st. But obviously with the COVID pandemic, things have slowed down. It's very hard to predict whether this new arrangement will take hold and become effective and lead toward integration of Africa's economic regions and indeed create potentially the largest free trade area in the world. And that will be the subject of a separate podcast in the near future. So that's where things stand. But now we're talking decades after Nkrumah had made that call. And I suppose people would say better later than never. There's one other development in recent years that is worth the subject of a podcast in the future, but I'll just mention it briefly as I wrap up today's discussion. And that is the emergence of the African diaspora. Because of the political turbulence and unpredictability in so many African countries, you have a huge number of Africans in diaspora who are now working in many European countries, in the United States, in Asia, and other parts of the world. And in recent years, they've been remitting monies back to relatives back on the continent. And in recent years, that number has now come close to $60 billion in annual remittances. So they've emerged as a new force in Africa, even though they're outside the continent, because the amount of money they send is so vast that it actually now exceeds all the so-called foreign aid annually that goes to African countries. And so I'll discuss a little more of the detail and the dynamics behind this when I do the podcast focusing on foreign aid, as I indicated in the beginning of this discussion. But as a result of this, the diaspora Africans have now also organized, and they often come and rally behind certain causes. So, for example, the recent coup d'etat in Chad, which is supported by France, you don't only have citizens of Chad in the diaspora who are involved in social media campaigns protesting against the coup d'etat, but you have Africans from other countries, including Uganda. I know that for a fact because I myself have participated in their campaigns. Africans from Nigeria, from Ghana. So, ironically, Africans in diaspora are coming together sort of as a United States of Africa in diaspora to push agenda that may be country specific, but would benefit all Africans generally. Let me just mention one other campaign. Total, the French company, is trying to build an oil pipeline. It's called the East African Crude Oil Pipeline from Uganda running through Tanzania, and then, of course, to the ports. And Africans, starting with Ugandans, but now Africans from all over the continents, and their friends from around the world, including Americans, Europeans, and Asians, and people in the Caribbean and South America, have joined this campaign to try to block that oil pipeline from being built. Number one, it would cause vast, devastating environmental destruction. Number two, it would cause great displacement of people from their lands, many of whom have already been displaced, and their homes have been burned by the military under the dictatorship of General Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. And then number three, in an era when the world is moving toward green or clean energy,